Testing. Testing! Hello? Hello? Is this thing actually capturing my voice? All right. I think the resonance is stable. I bought this modified arcane recording device from a gnome paladin named Kella Brightbolt. So if it suddenly starts shouting about the light or stops working, I am absolutely getting my coin back. All right, let's get this out of the way. If you are listening to this, I am either dead or I finally misplaced my bag in some tavern after a few too many ales. If I'm dead, please tell the Kirintor that I want my final paycheck sent to my favorite bartender. I decided to start keeping this journal because, well, I'm a half-elf. I'm only 28 right now, but I've got a lot of decades ahead of me. Human memory is famously leaky, and while my elven half is supposed to be all elegant and timeless, I literally forgot where I put my favorite surveying compass yesterday. If I'm going to be walking around Azeroth for the next few centuries, I better write things down before my brain runs out of storage space. I don't want my life turning into one of those exaggerated tavern tales people make up when playing Hearthstone. I want the truth written down. Speaking of the truth, I figured I should start at the actual beginning, how my parents met. People always assume a human and a high elf falling in love is some grand romantic ballad, but it wasn't. They met during the Second War. There was nothing romantic about it. It was brutal, muddy, and terrifying. Dad was just a mundane human footman. He wasn't a hero. He was just a guy with a sword trying to survive. Mom was a high elven magical researcher from Dalaran who had been drafted into the Alliance army to serve as a combat medic because they were desperately short on light-wielding priests. The battlefields back then weren't the small, scaled-down skirmishes you read about. The world is massive, and those armies marched across continents that stretched for thousands of miles. Dad's unit got ambushed by an orc patrol near the borders. He took a nasty axe wound to the side and was left bleeding out in the mud. That's where Mom found him. She didn't have any holy magic to heal him, and the orcs were still actively patrolling the area, hunting for survivors. So she had to improvise. She used her frost magic to numb his nerves and literally freeze his wounds shut to stop the bleeding. It was agonizing, but it kept him alive. Then, to keep them from being discovered, she cast a heavy illusion over the two of them, making them look like a large, mossy boulder. She sat there in the mud for hours, exhausting her mana to keep the illusion stable while the Horde raiding party walked right past them. Now, Dad was delirious from the blood loss and the freezing cold of the magic. He looked up at this beautiful, glowing elf who had just saved his life. Then my dad said,
"Did I die? Are you an angel?"
Mom was absolutely exhausted, covered in mud, and terrified that the illusion was going to break and get them both killed. She glared down at him. Then my mom said,
"If you don't shut up right now, I am going to freeze your mouth shut too."
After Dad passed out, my mom told me the rest. It wasn't funny then. It was pure terror. The orcs didn't just march by and leave. They stopped right next to them. Mom said she could hear their heavy, iron-shod boots squishing in the mud mere inches from where they were hiding. She could hear them sniffing the air, catching the faint scent of Dad's blood over the freezing rain. Every muscle in her body was screaming. High elves physically ache when they completely deplete their magic, and she had to hold that illusion of a mossy boulder for what felt like an eternity while the orcs argued about where the human tracks went. When the patrol finally moved on and the sun started to rise, she realized they were still miles away from the nearest Alliance encampment. And as I said, the world out there is immense. A few miles meant a grueling hours-long trek through hostile, rugged territory. She couldn't use magic to heal him further, and he was completely dead weight. So, this incredibly proud, highly educated Dalaran scholar threw a mud-covered, bleeding human footman over her shoulder. She practically carried and dragged him the entire way back. Every time she thought about dropping him in the mud and saving herself, she couldn't bring herself to do it. When she finally dragged him into the triage tent, the medics were stunned. After they got him stabilized, she just collapsed onto the floor, completely magically exhausted. But Mom didn't get to sit by his bedside like they do in the storybooks. When she woke up a few hours later, her commanding officer was standing over her, absolutely furious that she had risked her life and depleted her mana for a single human footman. Then the commander said, "You are a Kirintor Magus. You do not waste your arcane reserves playing pack mule for expendable infantry." Mom, who was currently nursing the worst magical migraine of her life and covered in dried mud, didn't even blink. Then my mom said,
If I wanted to let men bleed to death in the mud, I would have stayed in Dalaran and become a politician. Now give me my next assignment.
They immediately reassigned her. And because the world is functionally hundreds of times larger than it seems, reassigned meant she was shipped off to a magical artillery battalion on a completely different front line that was hundreds of miles away. When Dad woke up a day later, she was completely gone. And Dad didn't go looking for her. You can't just desert your post in the middle of a global war to chase a girl, especially when the continents are hundreds of times larger than they look on a map. He was an enlisted footman. He got patched up, handed a new shield, and marched right back into the meat grinder. For a month, they were just two soldiers fighting on completely different ends of a massive continent. But because the representation of the world in-game is scaled down, and places like Lordaeron are vastly larger in the actual lore, the Alliance eventually had to consolidate their forces. Dad's infantry unit was assigned to escort a heavy supply train to a massive staging encampment. The camp was huge, thousands of soldiers, tents stretching as far as the eye could see. Dad was hauling crates of rusted swords off a wagon when he spotted her. She was standing near the arcane artillery tents, studying a glowing magical ledger and looking completely exhausted. Now, Dad wasn't a fool. He knew she was a terrifyingly powerful mage who valued her peace and quiet, so he didn't just march right up to her like some overconfident tavern hero. Instead, he took a much more cautious, spy-like approach. He quietly slipped away from his wagon, kept his head down, and waited in the shadows of the supply crates until the quartermaster she was lecturing scurried away. He stepped out quietly, keeping a respectful distance so he wouldn't startle her. Then my dad said,
Excuse me, Magus? You're that elf that saved me, right? The one with the mossy boulder illusion?
Mom didn't jump. She just slowly turned her head, looking him up and down with absolute, freezing, high elven disdain. To a proud scholar of Dalaran, humans were loud, reckless, and constantly covered in mud. Then my mom said,
Footman, I triage dozens of expendable mortals a week. You will have to be far more specific.
Dad kept his voice low and steady, pointing to the patched-up hole in his armor. Then my dad said,
Orc patrol near the border. Freezing rain. You froze my ribs shut and practically carried me back to the tents.
Mom stared at his side, then back up at his face. For a highly composed elven scholar, Dad said she looked genuinely shocked. The magic glowing in her hands completely fizzled out. Whenever Dad told me this part of the story, Mom would always scoff from the other side of the room. She was a proud high elf, and she vehemently denied that she looked surprised at all. Then my mom would say,
I was merely recalibrating my monoflow, Thomas. A magus of my standing does not get shocked by a muddy infantryman.
But Dad would always just wink at me when she turned her back. Even decades later, her elven pride made her too shy to admit the truth. Anyway, my mom seeing him standing there alive had completely caught her off guard. She cleared her throat and quickly regained her composure. Then my mom said,
You're alive. I assumed you would have found another orc axe to trip onto by now.
It was a harsh thing to say, but Dad knew she was secretly incredibly relieved. High elves don't like admitting when they care about mundane human things, let alone an expendable footman she had risked her life to save. Dad didn't push his luck. He didn't try to charm her or offer to buy her a drink. He just looked around at the chaotic, deafening war camp. Then my dad said,
I try to avoid axes these days, but I wanted to find you and say thank you. And I noticed you looked like you'd rather be anywhere else in the world than listening to these soldiers yell.
Mom let out a heavy, aristocratic sigh and rubbed her temples. Then my mom said,
I have been stuck in this miserable, deafening camp for a week. The noise is disrupting my ley line calculations, and the only thing these soldiers know how to do is play mindless games of Hearthstone in the mud.
Dad just smiled. He knew Hearthstone was just a magical tavern game full of exaggerated flavor lore, but he also knew it was a quiet game, and he was actually pretty good at it. Then my dad said,
I happen to have a deck in my pack. If you want a quiet distraction, I could let you win a few hands. No talking required.
Mom narrowed her eyes. insulted that he thought he had to let her win, which was exactly the bait Dad was hoping she'd take. She ruthlessly dismantled his deck for the next 3 hours while the war raged on around them. And that, future Melton, is how you actually court a high elf. You don't write them poetry or buy them drinks. You approach them carefully, let them insult you, and then you play cards with them in the mud. Dad said they played for over 2 hours on that overturned crate in the mud. Now, from an in-universe perspective, Hearthstone is just a magical card game with its own colorful depictions and tavern tales. It constitutes flavor lore played by many of Azeroth's denizens. But to Mom, it was a rigidly structured puzzle she could completely control, which was exactly what she desperately needed in the middle of a chaotic, unpredictable war. Around the 5th game, Dad noticed her shoulders finally drop. The glowing frost magic she constantly kept wreathed around her fingers. A nervous habit she'd developed to make herself look intimidating to the human soldiers quietly fizzled out. She even stopped lecturing him on his loud human breathing. She drew a card, looked at the artwork, and let out a genuine, exhausted laugh. Then my mom said,
This game is completely absurd. The flavor lore on this card implies a single mage could freeze an entire continent. It is mathematically impossible.
Dad just smiled, organizing his hand. Then my dad said,
It's just a game, Magus. It's supposed to be exaggerated. It's not supposed to be an official canon history of the world.
Mom shook her head, tracing the edge of the magical card. Then my mom said,
It's wildly inaccurate. The reality of this world is far more grueling. Do you have any idea how immense these continents actually are outside of the simplified maps the generals use? The amount of localized leyline energy required to cast a spell of that magnitude would completely sever the...
She suddenly stopped talking. She looked up, realizing she was rambling about arcane theory to an uneducated human footman. She immediately stiffened, her elven pride trying to snap back into place to hide her slip-up. She expected him to look bored, or to try and make a cheap joke. But Dad wasn't laughing. He was just watching her with quiet, genuine respect, waiting for her to finish her thought. Mom looked around at the deafening, muddy camp. She looked at the scar on Dad's side that she had frozen shut weeks ago. For the first time since she was drafted out of Dalaran, the haughty, untouchable High Elven scholar completely dropped her mask. She let out a long, shaky breath and set her cards face down on the crate. Then my mom said,
I am so tired. I am unbelievably tired of the mud and the noise and the sheer scale of this war. And I am tired of pretending I am not terrified every single time I am ordered to the front lines.
It was the most vulnerable thing Dad had ever heard her say. He knew how much it cost her pride to admit that to a human. He didn't try to charm her. He didn't offer a cheesy pickup line or tell her everything was going to be fine. He just gently tapped the table. Then my dad said,
I know. Me too. It's your turn, by the way. And I think you're losing.
Mom stared at him for a second. Then a small, very real smile broke across her face. She picked her cards back up and proceeded to absolutely obliterate him in the next 3 turns. After she played her final card, some exaggerated legendary minion that Dad noted was just flavor lore for the tavern game and not an actual historical entity, he chuckled and started gathering up the deck from the muddy crate. He tapped the stack of cards against his palm, looking across the crate at her. He held out his hand, keeping his voice quiet over the din of the chaotic encampment. Then my dad said,
I'm Thomas, by the way. Thomas Vance, 3rd Lord Aaron Infantry.
Mom looked at his outstretched hand. She didn't shake it. She was still a proud high elf after all. But she gave him a slow, elegant nod of acknowledgement, dropping the haughty Dalaran scholar persona just enough to let him in. Then my mom said,
Lyra Frostweaver of the Kirintor.
Dad pulled his hand back and smiled. But even though the game was over, the massive staging encampment around them was still deafening, because this camp was practically the size of a city. Thousands of soldiers were shouting, armor was clanking, and the noise was inescapable. Mom was rubbing her temples again, her sensitive elven ears twitching at the awful racket. Dad packed his cards away and gestured toward the distant edge of the sprawling camp. Then my dad said,
Well, Lyra Frostweaver. The perimeter guard posts are about a mile out. It's a lot quieter by the tree line, and I know a path that avoids the main infantry tents. If you want some actual peace and quiet, care to take a walk?
Mom looked toward the dark edge of the camp, then back at him. To a Kirin Tor scholar, wandering off into the dark with a muddy footman was highly improper. Her elven pride almost made her refuse on principle. But he had been respectful, he hadn't tried to hit on her, and more importantly, he was offering her an escape from the noise. She stood up, brushing non-existent dust off her pristine robes, lifting her chin with that haughty, untouchable pride. Then my mom said,
I suppose I could tolerate your presence for a short walk, Thomas Vance, provided you maintain a respectful distance and do not attempt any further terrible jokes.
Dad just grinned and picked up his sword. Then my dad said,
Deal. Lead the way, Magus.
They didn't fall in love that exact night. But Dad always said that long, quiet walk was the moment she stopped looking at him like a noisy mayfly and started looking at him like a person. A person she didn't mind having around. Sun's coming up. The arcane crystal I was using for light finally burnt out, but the ley line node is stable, so I have a few minutes to write while I wait for my tea to boil over the campfire. So, Dad and Mom took that walk, and after that, things actually changed. They didn't fall madly in love overnight, but they became friends. Real friends. As the Second War dragged on, they actively started seeking each other out. If Dad's infantry unit was stationed near the Kirin Tor artillery tents, he would bring her an extra ration of hot tea. If Mom was drafting ley line maps, she would magically freeze the mud around Dad's sentry post so he wouldn't have to stand in the muck all night. This went on for months. A single military campaign across the vast, sprawling territories of Lordaeron took seasons, not days. Eventually, the Alliance generals ordered a massive push into the snowy, treacherous mountain passes of northern Lordaeron. Because the terrain was so brutal, Mom was deployed directly to the vanguard to cast localized frost wards, preventing the heavy snowdrifts from crushing the supply wagons. And Dad's unit was assigned as her direct infantry escort. For weeks, they marched together through the freezing peaks. Dad was basically her personal bodyguard, and Mom didn't complain about his loud human presence once. But the mountains were unforgiving. During a brutal blizzard, an orc raiding party ambushed the vanguard. An explosion from a horde powder keg triggered a massive avalanche right above where Mom was standing. Dad didn't even think. He dropped his shield, sprinted through the snow, and tackled her out of the direct path of the boulders. But the snow came down entirely too fast. To save them both from being buried alive, Mom had to instantly cast a massive reinforced dome of solid ice over them. The sheer amount of magical energy required to instantly freeze that much falling snow completely drained her mana reserves in a matter of seconds. When the avalanche settled, they were trapped in a pitch-black, freezing pocket of ice beneath tons of snow, completely separated from the army. Without her magic to regulate her body temperature, Mom started shivering violently. High elves physically ache when their mana is depleted, and the cold of the Lordaeron mountains was rapidly creeping in. She couldn't cast a single spark to warm them. Dad didn't panic. He pulled out his mundane survival flint, managed to get a tiny fire going with some splintered wood from a broken wagon wheel, and then unclasped his heavy wool infantry cloak. He wrapped it around her shoulders, the exact same cloak she had once threatened to freeze his blood over if he brought it near her. Then my dad said,
You're shaking, Lyra. Keep the cloak on. We just have to wait for the Kirin Tor dig teams to find the magical signature of this ice dome.
Mom didn't push the cloak away. She pulled it tighter around herself, her elven pride completely stripped away by the freezing dark and the sheer exhaustion. Then my mom said,
It is freezing. I suppose your filthy human wool is marginally better than freezing to death.
She said it, but there was no venom in her voice. It was soft, and her voice was shaking. Dad moved closer to the tiny fire and took her freezing, trembling hands in his own, rubbing them to keep the circulation going. Then my dad said,
I thought high elves never got cold.
Mom looked down at his bruised, calloused hands holding hers. She looked up at his face, illuminated by the tiny, flickering fire. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead where he had tackled her into the rocks, but he wasn't looking at his own wounds. He was only looking at her, completely focused on keeping her safe. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just annoyed by the thought of him dying. She was utterly terrified of it. She cared about him, not as a curious human pet, but as her equal. Then my mom said,
Only when we exhaust all our magic trying to save reckless, idiotic infantrymen who throw themselves in front of avalanches.
Then my dad said,
I wasn't going to let you get crushed, Lyra. I crossed continents for you. Remember?
Mom stopped shivering. She looked at him in the dim light, the space between them suddenly feeling incredibly small. And then, the proud, untouchable high elf of Dalaran leaned forward and kissed the muddy, scarred, human footman right there in the dark. Dad said he was so shocked he almost dropped her hands into the fire, but he recovered quickly enough to kiss her back. They stayed huddled together under that cloak for 6 hours before the Alliance dig teams finally broke through the ice. And that's the real story. No grand romantic ballads, just a cave-in, an old wool cloak, and 2 stubborn soldiers who finally figured it out. Shit, the water's boiling. Time to get moving. Melton Vance Frostweaver, signing off. Note to self. Arcane anomalies do not taste like blueberries, no matter what color they glow. I just spent the last hour trying to get the taste of static electricity out of my mouth after a surveying mishap. You'd think a guy who works with ley lines for a living would stop touching glowing things without gloves on, but here we are. Anyway, yesterday I wrote about the avalanche, the wool cloak, and how my parents finally figured out they liked each other in that freezing ice cave. But surviving a cave-in is the easy part. Building a life after a war is the hard part. When the Second War finally ended, Mom was recalled to the Kirin Tor in Dalaran to resume her research, and Dad's infantry unit was sent south to be decommissioned. They were supposed to go their separate ways. To Mom, it felt like the harsh reality of their different lives was finally catching up to them. But Dad was entirely too stubborn for that. He took his meager army severance, packed his rucksack, and marched his way to Dalaran. He found a tiny, drafty storefront in the lower craftsman districts and set up a bookbinding and repair shop. The second he had the doors open, he started trying to track Mom down. But a mundane craftsman can't exactly stroll past the arcane ward guards into the high archives. He spent weeks looking for her, but he couldn't find her anywhere. However, it didn't actually take that long for fate to step in. Just a few weeks after he opened, Mom pushed open the door of the new local bookbinder, carrying a stack of frost-damaged field ledgers. Dad was behind the counter. He looked up, wiped the glue off his apron, and froze. Then my dad said,
Lyra?
Mom dropped her books. They hit the floor with a heavy thud. She stared at him, and then, instead of looking relieved, her elven pride flared up, and she looked absolutely furious. Then my mom said,
Thomas Vance, you moved to my city, open a shop, and you do not even have the decency to send me a letter? I had to find you by complete accident while running errands?
Dad walked out from behind the counter. He didn't flinch at her anger at all. Then my dad said,
I didn't ignore you, Lyra. I've spent the last 3 weeks trying to find you, but nobody in the upper wards will pass a message from a human bookbinder. I tried, but I couldn't reach you. I missed you. Moving here just to have a chance of running into you again was the best choice I ever made.
Mom's anger completely melted. All that haughty, untouchable pride she usually carried just vanished. She didn't say another word about the letters or the books. She just walked right up to him, grabbed the collar of his sawdust-covered shirt, and kissed him right there in the shop. Dad flipped the closed sign on the door, and they went out on their first actual date right then and there. Now, if you are reading this hoping for a grand romantic recounting of that evening, you are out of luck. My parents flat out refused to ever tell me the details of that first date. Whenever I asked about it growing up, Dad would just smirk, and Mum would suddenly find a very important ley line calculation that required her immediate attention. I never got the details, but whatever happened on that date, it worked. After that day, they were officially a couple. And a few years after that, well, they had me. Being born a half-elf to a Kirin Tor Magus means there are some amount of expectations. I mentioned before that I started this journal because I'm a half-elf with a long lifespan ahead of me. But what I didn't mention is just how rare we actually are. Because humans and high elves rarely ever got together, a half-elf child in Dalaran was seen as a complete novelty. To the other scholars of the city, A child with both human stubbornness and ancient high elven magical lineage was expected to be some unprecedented, world-altering prodigy. Mom certainly bought into the hype. She told me that when I was a baby, she watched my crib like a hawk for any sign of arcane brilliance. I wasn't the grand, localized, blizzard-causing anomaly the city expected, but I did have a little bit of the arcane in my blood. Whenever I got really excited or threw a tantrum, my wooden blocks would hover a few inches off the floor, or my fingertips would spark with harmless blue static electricity. To Mom, this was the greatest thing in the world. She was a proud, highly educated Dalaran scholar, and seeing her rare half-elf son naturally connect to the magical currents made her absolutely beam with pride. Then my mom said,
Look at his innate focus, Thomas. He is a perfect synthesis of our bloodlines. He is already manipulating the local gravity fields. He's going to be a brilliant magus.
Dad, who usually had to be the one to pluck the floating wooden blocks out of the air before they hit someone, would just laugh and shake his head. Then my dad said,
He's not a magical synthesis, Lyra. He's just trying to reach his pacifier. And please take the cat out of the room before he accidentally shocks its tail again.
I wasn't the unprecedented magical anomaly the city expected. I was just a normal kid with a few magical sparks, a stubborn human dad, and a brilliant elven mom, growing up in a city of magic, learning how to fix books and practice minor cantrips. Growing up as a half-elf in Dalaran was basically a masterclass in living between two completely different worlds. Because I have a lot of decades ahead of me, my childhood moved at a strange pace. But the biggest contrast wasn't my age, it was my parents. Mom was a highly educated, deeply respected Kirin Tor magus. She spent her days in the towering, pristine spires of the upper archives, calculating ley lines and mapping the immense, continent-spanning magical currents of the world. Everything about her world was elegant, precise, and spotless. Dad, on the other hand, was a completely mundane human who spent his days in a drafty, sawdust-covered bookbinding shop in the lower craftsman districts. His world smelled like old parchment, strong tea, and heavy animal glue. Naturally, Mom wanted to ensure my magical education started early. To a proud, high elven scholar, magic isn't just a tool, it's an art form. When I was around 10 years old, she decided it was time to teach me how to conjure a basic frost ward. She cleared out a space in the back of Dad's shop, stood me in front of a bucket of water, and demonstrated. With a graceful flick of her wrist, a perfect glowing flower made of solid ice bloomed over the bucket. Then my mom said,
Now you try, Melton. The arcane is an elegant river. You must not force it. You must gently guide the temperature down until the water surrenders to the frost.
I stared at the bucket. I focused as hard as I could. I tried to feel the elegant river she was talking about, but all I felt was the draft coming through the shop window and the fact that my knees ached from sitting on a stool all morning. I didn't have her ancient, innate elven grace. I had my dad's stubborn, blunt force human approach to problem solving. I got frustrated, gritted my teeth, and shoved all my meager magical energy at the bucket at once. There was a loud pop, a flash of blue light, and instead of a delicate ice flower, the entire bucket, along with a nearby pot of Dad's expensive bookbinding glue, instantly flash froze into a solid, jagged block of cloudy ice. Mom let out a heavy, aristocratic sigh and rubbed her temples, a habit she still had from her days in the chaotic war camps. Then my mom said,
That was not guiding the river, Melton. That was throwing a boulder into it. You lack finesse.
Dad poked his head out from the front counter, wiping sawdust off his apron. He looked at the ruined, frozen pot of glue, then looked at me. Then my dad said,
Well, that's one way to keep the pages stuck together. Good job, kid.
Mom glared at him, though I could see the corners of her mouth twitching. Then my mom said,
Do not encourage his reckless casting, Thomas. If he cannot master basic temperature control, he will never survive the academy.
Then my dad said,
He'll be fine, Lyra. He just needs to do it his own way. Not everyone has to be an elegant scholar. Sometimes you just need to freeze the damn bucket.
But Mom didn't let that stand. She was an incredibly proud, highly educated Dalaran scholar, and she was absolutely determined that her son would master the elegant arts of the Kirin Tor. And that was just the beginning of my magical education. I spent my entire childhood learning the intricate nuances of frost magic under her strict, watchful eye. She pushed me relentlessly, refusing to let me settle for my dad's blunt force human approach. When I became a teenager, I enrolled in the Kirin Tor academies. I finally found my calling. I knew magic was useful, and sure, casting a perfect frost ward is pretty to look at. But what really captivated me wasn't the spells themselves, it was the mechanics behind them. I wanted to know exactly how the magic worked. That obsession led me straight to the ley lines. To me, the invisible magical arteries that pump arcane energy across the continents were the most fascinating puzzle in the world. I didn't want to be a combat mage. I wanted to understand the ley lines, chart them, and figure out how to maintain them. I spent my entire education in the archives studying magical infrastructure. Eventually, reading about the world's magical currents from a desk wasn't enough. I wanted to see them in the wild, so I packed my bags to leave Dalaran and become a field surveyor. But Mom wasn't about to just let her only son wander out into the dangerous wilds alone. For the first few years of my career, the proud Kirin Tor Magus actually packed her own travel bag and came with me. She helped me calibrate my early equipment, stubbornly making sure I was perfectly mapping the nodes before she finally trusted me enough to let me work on my own. Even after I started traveling solo, I would periodically return to Dalaran to learn new techniques. When I was 25, I returned to the academies and finally mastered portal magic. Let me tell you, when you live in a world where the continents are immensely massive and stretch for thousands of miles, a portal is the greatest spell ever invented. It made the exhausting life of a traveling surveyor so much easier. But there was a catch. I could only open portals to established magical hubs like Dalaran. It was a perfect way to travel back home, but I couldn't cast a portal out into the middle of an uncharted forest or a snowy mountain peak to actually get to my surveying sites. I spent 2 years complaining about having to walk or take carriages outbound, until my dad finally solved the problem for me. When I turned 27, I walked out of the shop to find Dad holding the reins of a massive, incredibly stubborn griffin. He had used a huge chunk of the bookshop's savings to buy him for me. He knew I needed a reliable way to travel to the wilderness, since my magic could only bring me home. And that brings us to today. I am 28 right now. I've got a lot of decades ahead of me, and I spend my life flying across the world to maintain its magic. It perfectly blends Mom's complex ley line calculations with Dad's desire to just pack a bag and do some honest, practical work in the wilds. All right, my tongue has finally stopped buzzing from that anomaly. Time to get back to the surveying grid. Melton Vance Frostweaver, signing off.
Your old life has passed. The light will forge you a new one.
It is not yours to take.
The light will heal your scars.
I am my scars.
The light is your destiny.